Leave of absence for an operation. We no longer allow this practice. We wish to discourage any thoughts that you may need an operation, as we believe, as long as you are an employee here, you will need all of whatever you have. And you should consider not having anything removed. We hired you as you are, and to have anything removed would certainly make you less than we bargained for. Finally, death, your own. This will be accepted as an excuse, but we would like 2 weeks' notice, as we feel it is your duty to teach someone else your job. Well, that kind of humorous approach to a difficult problem indicates that human beings generally, when the going gets tough, get tough themselves, and tough with one another. And so it's interesting to ask ourselves, is there a Christian response to this kind of crisis in social action? There may not be a Christian economics or a Christian politics, but there is a Christian way of response to social crisis, a Christian way of endurance. And as we look at the world problems today that we are forced to grapple with world hunger, with the question in southern Africa, with many other policies that one must decide in terms of the use of our investments as a church and so on, how do we take the correct strategy? Is there one solution? How do we find that out? It's interesting that Luther wrote 3 treatises to this town of Leipzig. And I've quoted in the first 2 lectures 2 of them. The third is a very brief preface to the ordinance of the common chest. And although this preface appeared before the crisis in Leipzig, in the preface Luther seems to predict what will happen and tries to prepare people for a suitable way of bearing through and working on in the midst of disappointment and crisis. What about greed, he said? What happens if somebody wants too much of that fund, which was exactly what happened. He said, at all costs we have to avoid a mad scramble for the assets. So what if someone wants extra, he said. We cannot just let things slide on that account. He said, perhaps the heirs of the founders will come and demand more than their share, saying that they had never donated anything and they needed it back. He said, if they are poor and needy, give them some money, because they indeed were not responsible for the gift in the first place. They need funds as much as anybody else. Or how about the monks that would refuse to leave the monastery? As Luther said, either because of age or their bellies or their conscience. Either they be too old to leave or too comfortable to leave or feel too committed to the old faith. What about them? He said, you shouldn't turn them out. You ought to provide for them. Unfortunately, as monks, he said, they never learned a trade. They have nothing to do. And so you ought to take care of them and thereby demonstrate that the Reformation was not for the purpose of greed. Secondly, he said, when the greed comes, when the problems arise, recognize it. There's always going to be opposition to those who try to work for social change. I quote, you're going to have to expect and take comfort from the fact that if what you are undertaking is of God, it will necessarily meet with vigorous opposition, for Satan never rests or takes a holiday. In our country, we have the idea generally that if it's right, it's going to succeed. Luther believed that if it was really God's work, it would likely run into, as he says here, vigorous opposition. Well, when you run into vigorous opposition, you discover that your base of support begins to erode. What do you do then when you discover you're almost all alone? Well do I know, he writes, that few will accept such advice. I am content if only 1 or 2 follow me, or would at least like to follow me. Now, how in the world can one accept such a low level of commitment? I believe one can do that only if one truly believes in salt and leaven. If one truly is committed to the fact that the single act done for and in the conscience of God's power can be used by God in His time, even though it may not be 1522 or 23 or 30 or 40. Someday God can use that work and that stand. Luther, I believe, put it most effectively in an explanation he wrote to the first article of the Creed in 1520. This is much before, almost 10 years before his small catechism. It's a very precious and powerful statement to me, and it describes exactly this confidence that in the area of creation, in the area of social action and justice in the world, ultimately one does not trust to clever plans or to power blocks, but ultimately one does what one has to do and recognize that it is in God's hands. He wrote this in 1520, the year that he was excommunicated, the year that all power was stripped from him. He was an outlaw and seemed to stand alone. In those circumstances, he was able to write, "I will trust in God, though all men forsake or persecute me. I will still trust, though I be poor, dull, unlearned, despised, or penniless. Sinner though I am, still I will trust more strongly in God's grace. My faith will rise above everything, above things that abide and things that fail, above sin and virtue, until it rests pure and true in God alone, as the first commandment requires. I seek no sign from heaven to test God, and though he tarry, I will count on him with confidence. I set for him no limit or time, I fix for him no measure or mode, but in faith pure and free commit everything to his hands. He is God, omniscient, almighty, able to help in every time of need. He is creator of all things and Lord of heaven and earth. Of whom then should I be afraid? He is almighty, ever present to help in time of trouble. He is my Father. From his loving hands I receive my every need. Nothing doubting, I will trust in him alone, and thus remain his child and servant and heir forever. And as I trust, so shall it be.